A very warm welcome, everyone, to this seventh webinar for INTBAU's Architecture Challenge. My name is Harriet Wenberg, and I'm Executive Director of INTBAU, which is a global network dedicated to creating better places to live. So as with all previous sessions, you're joining us today from all around the world, helping to make this a very global series, not to mention those of you that will watch this and catch up later on our YouTube channel. The INTBAU Architecture Challenge is a competition for low carbon, no carbon, and carbon negative designs for resilient and adaptable houses. You've still got just over 2 months to come up with your proposals for the design competition, which is open for your submissions until the 9th of May. And all details on how to register and how to submit a design proposal are online at challenge.intbau.org. And there'll be cash prizes for selected entries, and we'll also work with winners to look for opportunities to construct and test their designs in the contexts for which they're intended. So the competition brief asks participants to have a specific site for their design in mind. And key to selecting and designing for a site is an understanding of some of the factors that shape the two main areas in which we build and live, which are the urban and the rural. So our 4 speakers today will set the scene and also share case studies from the Maldives, from Spain, and from Poland. And we'll then move to discussion and questions from you, our participants, and you can type your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. So without further ado, it's thanks and over to Patrick Lampson-Hall, our first speaker. Patrick is an urban planner and a research scholar at the New York University Moron Institute of Urban Management. His research is focused on forecasting global urban growth with a main goal of developing downscaled maps for future urban development for 200 global cities through 2050 using publicly available input data. Patrick, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak at this event. I think it's a really critical thing. And I know that one of the things that I've observed in my work, especially in developing countries, is a real loss of local knowledge and vernacular and sustainable architectural styles. So it was interesting for me to think about how urban planning can support those activities. I'm going to start by giving some background information coming from research that I've conducted with my team at the Maynard Institute that gives some of the context of global urban growth, and then talk about how urban planning can help support and manage that growth. So just looking at the growth that's occurring by the numbers, thinking about the total world population, the urban population, and then the rural population, the global population has actually doubled 3 times since 1900, from about 1.6 billion to around 7.8 billion today. It will increase to 9.7 billion by 2050 before leveling off at around 11 billion in the early 22nd century. So after doubling 3 times, we don't expect it to double again. Now, the global urban population grew much faster. It doubled more than 4 times since 1900, from only 224 million to 4.4 billion today. And it will increase by another 2.3 billion to 6.7 billion by 2050 before leveling off at around 8.8 billion in the early 22nd century. So we do have one more doubling of the urban population that will happen. Now, the global rural population is growing more slowly. It doubled once, and it will actually decline from 3.4 billion today to about 3.1 billion by 2050, and will continue declining to around 2.2 billion in the early 22nd century. So what we see here is that the total increase in the urban population is going to be actually a bit more than the total increase in the global population. And the reason why that's possible is because people are moving from rural areas to cities. And if we think about this in the context of levels of development, using the UN regions, more developed and less developed, we can see that vastly more growth is occurring in developing countries than developed ones, which have essentially stopped growing entirely. In fact, for every 1 person who moves to a city in a developed country, 18 people will move to a city in a developing country. tried with this list to prioritize the changes that I think are most important in the short term. Now, there aren't any silver bullets. Everything isn't going to be perfect, and many things will be imperfect for a long time. But if cities can focus on providing adequate land for housing, which makes up most of the cost of housing for a poor person, this will make housing more affordable for new citizens. If they focus on basic services, titles, and regulations, they can encourage investment in housing and investment in urban areas. And then if they focus on the key infrastructure good of arterial roads, they can make the whole labor market function better and create a more orderly and sustainable framework for growth. So I'm going to use my remaining few minutes to elaborate on this just slightly. When it comes to land for housing, the cost of land is the biggest obstacle to having a home, especially for new migrants to cities. So any actions that make land more accessible and more available help address the housing challenge for the poor more than almost any other action. There's a range of activities here, but the main thing to think about is that the cheapest land in cities is always on the edge, on the periphery. And this is where the poor often settle. And so cities can make more land available by actually planning for this growth. What this consists of, and we have a great picture of a team working on this in a city in Ethiopia, a project that I've run, is designating expansion areas that are actually at the right scale, the right area to meet the future needs in terms of land demand. Making this land supply abundant and predictable will lower the price and let new urban residents in particular invest more in their buildings. Now, they can also work to make land available implicitly through regulations. And that means allowing people to more efficiently use the land they've already got. Planners can do this by reducing the consumption minimums, which are rules that kind of require people to consume a certain minimum amount of land. Those are rules like building height restrictions, FAR and FSI rules, setbacks, minimum unit sizes, and other regulations. What these things do is they impose standards that are well-intended, but that poor people are often unable to afford. From the perspective of ensuring the success of vernacular architecture, in my view, the biggest threat isn't a shortage of local materials or a shortage of inventiveness or creativity on the part of locals. The three biggest issues, which I try to address here, are zoning codes, building codes, and a lack of finance. These are made worse by real infrastructure deficits. The idea here is that if you can create the correct regulatory framework, a relaxed regulatory framework that encourages people to have title for their properties, that allows them to develop housing incrementally over time, like we see in this diagram and in this image, and putting in place relaxed building and zoning codes that let them use architecture styles and modes of development that are familiar, materials that are familiar, you'll end up with housing types that more closely match local needs and conditions. This is really critical over time. If you can back this up with services, then that investment can actually translate into real improvements in the standard of living. Finally, arterial roads. Now, this might seem a little bit out of the blue, but when planners are actually facing large urban development on the periphery, they don't have a lot of options to control it. But one thing that they can do is put in place a basic framework, a road network that ties the city together. And this is something that I've worked on with the Princess Foundation, which has a really great toolkit, and also on initiatives in Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, Colombia, and other countries. The basic idea is just to put in a 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer arterial grid that will allocate infrastructure to tie the city together. It has benefits that are documented, listed here. And it's not enough just to plan this grid. You also have to actually secure the land for the grid before development occurs, because otherwise the grid rights of ways will be squatted on. So one initiative that we've worked on is the idea of actually planting trees along the rights of ways of the future roads. And what this does is it really frames out the pattern in the city, really frames out how the city will look in the future in a way that creates order in the long term and keeps options open for future development while reducing the price of providing infrastructure. So there's a lot in this presentation. I probably put in about twice as much as I should have, but the big picture takeaways are that planning can have a major role to play in supporting the development of better buildings. Slum upgrading, regularization, incremental development are critical. we should be thinking about developing countries when we focus on these issues. And we should also be thinking about informal development, which is where most of the population is currently being accommodated. It comes down to rules and systems, and there's a lot that we can do using those things and proper planning to help address the pressing challenges of rapid urbanization that are facing these countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was a really good example of how much you can fit into 15 minutes, being able to put a lot of information and a lot of figures and facts and research that you've worked on, but also numbers that I think make sense to all of us, sort of in lived experience of whether we've been in urban areas, rural areas, looking at other countries around the world. So really interesting and a great start to the session. Thank you very much. Come to our second speaker for today, who's Dr. Alex Arnold, and Alex is a human geographer conducting research and teaching on environmental change and human migration and mobility. His work is characterized by an environment theme, including climate change, agricultural development, and food systems. And much of his empirical research has taken place in the Maldives, Mozambique, and the UK. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, so, well, thank you very much, Harriet, for the introduction and for inviting me to do this this talk with you. I'm just going to start my stopwatch. Here we go. So, yes, and we heard from the previous speaker, from Patrick there, giving us some, you know, sort of the big picture really. And what I'm going to do in this talk is I'm intending just to zoom in a little bit and look at some of the issues and dilemmas facing one particular country, which is the Maldives, which is where I've been going to and doing research probably, well, actually probably coming up to about 10 years now. And I originally went to the Maldives to look at, you know, climate change and sea level rise. And that, of course, is a big issue there. But I've also got involved in a lot of other research in the Maldives. And one of the things I've come to realize really is in the Maldives, it's the relationship between the urban and the rural that is really is key to economic development in this country. And in the longer term, in terms of adapting and coping with climate change and other sorts of environmental changes as well. And in the Maldives, the urban-rural setup is quite unusual, really, due to the archipelagic nature of the country. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at this urban-rural dynamic in some detail and explain some of the challenges that the country faces as a result. So very quick sort of potted introduction then to the Maldives. As you probably know, the Maldives is located in the Indian Ocean. It's about 2,000 kilometers south of India. And the Maldives is an archipelago, of course, and it consists of around 1,200 islands. And these are grouped roughly into 26 atolls. And the country has a population of around 450,000 people. And these people are dispersed across roughly 190 islands. So it's a fascinating place to visit. And I've spent quite a lot of time in different inhabited islands in the Maldives, talking to people about various sort of environment and development dilemmas that they face. What I want to do over the next, just briefly over the next 3 slides, just mention what I call sort of grand narratives, I suppose, with regard to the Maldives. So grand challenges that many people will be familiar with that this country faces. So when we talk about the Maldives, different kinds of images, you know, come to mind, and the first one, probably the primary one, is of course probably international tourism, and International tourism is the mainstay of the economy. I think something like 40% of GDP comes from high-end tourism in the Maldives. The main source of economic activity in the Maldives until the 1980s or 90s was tuna fishing. But as the Maldives tourism policy got underway, it moved more and more towards international tourism. And the country today operates what's called a one island, one resort policy. So this kind of ensures that there's limited mixing between international holidaymakers and the locals, so to speak. So today there are around 130 resorts located in the Maldives. The second sort of grand problem or challenge is, of course, climate change and sea level rise, and the Maldives is well known for this problem. And these pictures here are taken from around 2009, when the Maldives was particularly active in international sort of climate change action. And thirdly, just reference, I mean, I know geopolitics is something that's, you know, very much on people's minds at the moment, and indeed in the Maldives, this country has its own particular geopolitical story as well. I haven't got time to go into the details, but just to say, historically, the Maldives has been seen as traditionally aligned with India, and therefore the sort of democratic West. But in recent decades, it has kind of emerged a sort of tug of war, if you like, between over influence in the Maldives between India and what's seen as its regional rival, which is China. At present, the ruling party in the Maldives is the Maldivian Democratic Party, which is very much seen as linked to the West and to India. But in the past, the Maldives has worked quite closely as well with China and with its Belt and Road Initiative, for example. So those are the kind of the major narratives, really, around the Maldives. But another question we can ask is, well, you know, kind of under those, so to speak, what is actually happening on the ground in the Maldives? And to understand island development in the Maldives, what I want to do is actually briefly define what is meant by the urban and the rural and what the relationship is between them. So in the Maldives, the urban context is very much seen as one island, which is the capital island of Male. And in Male, we have something like 220,000 people living in around 6 square kilometers of land. So half the country's population actually lives on this one island. And as you can see from the images on the left, these are old images of Male taken from 1910s, 1920s. You can see that Male has been characterized by a massive rural to urban migration, mainly people seeking out jobs, education, and healthcare as well. So what is the rule in the Maldives? Well, there is a division. So in the Maldives, there's tend to be a division created when people talk about Male and other islands. So they tend to refer to the outer islands. Often they'll call them rural islands as well. So anything that isn't Male is rural. It's considered to be rural, so to speak. So many of these, I'm saying so-called rural islands because when you look at them, many don't look that rural particularly. Many of them look like this island on the left. This is the island of Dafushi, which is located about 40 kilometers from the capital, Male. As you can see, Dafushi is actually fairly densely populated, but it's considered rural, I guess you could say, in other ways. So from the Male perspective, Dafushi would be seen as quieter, less densely populated, as greener. as perhaps a kind of simpler way of life. So that in the Maldives would constitute rural. But there are other kinds of islands that are rural as well. As you can see on the right, we do have agriculture islands in the Maldives too. They are fairly few and far between, but they are important because of food production. It's a big issue in the Maldives. Most food is imported, and these islands produce food that can be distributed around the archipelago nationally. So historically, the central government in Mali has, I think it's fair to say, has resisted development on outer islands. And this is for various reasons, to do with service provision, to do with political control. And in recent decades, the central government has tended to pursue a policy of population resettlement to what it calls island hubs. These are larger islands, a bit like Mali, I guess, where populations would be concentrated. And this program has never really been implemented because it's so politically unpopular. Although interestingly, in the 2010s, when climate change was very much on the Maldivian political agenda, there was a renewed talk of the need for population resettlement to create so-called resilient islands in the Maldives. However, due to the politics of atolls and local islands, or rural islands, the policy now is actually to distribute services and economic opportunities to rural islands. And as a result of these changes, there's some very quite major transformations that are occurring on many inhabited islands in the Maldives. And what I want to do is, for the rest of my talk, is just to briefly outline what some of those changes are. So the first sort of major change that we're seeing on inhabited islands or rural islands in the Maldives is around land reclamation. Now, as you can see in the top right, land reclamation in the Maldives can, produce major physical changes on islands. Now, this land reclamation is very, very popular because, well, the main reason being that it creates more space for housing. As you can see on this island here, housing is quite dense, and there's often demand for extra space for housing to be built, but also perhaps construction of light industry as well. And of course, it goes further than that too, and also it's about recognition too. I mean, if an island is reclaimed, it means that island is being kind of politically recognized, and that's quite a big deal. Now, a lot of this reclamation, I would say, is relatively kind of symbolic, in that many reclaimed areas actually stay unused for many, many years, or never used. Now, given the ecological impacts to a reclamation, this is potentially quite a big issue. But yeah, land reclamation is a big change that's occurring. Along with reclamation, harbour and various activities of coastal development are also changing what's going on rural islands in the Maldives and kind of urbanizing these islands. So historically, this is a picture from the 1970s on the left. Historically, a typical island would be large sandy beaches and perhaps a jetty for boats to arrive and to depart. But these days, on local islands, there's considerable demand for harbours and other forms of coastal protection. So in the 1990s, the government embarked on a major harbour construction program, quite an expensive harbour construction program. Now, of course, harbours for small rural islands can be very significant. They connect islands up to other islands and to the capital, Male, and economically they can be quite important as well. But it's also, I think it's fair to say that harbour construction in the Maldives has caused quite a lot of problems as well. Many of the harbours that were rolled out as part of the program in the 90s followed a kind of blueprint approach. They weren't really adapted to local environmental conditions, and as a result, they've had quite negative impacts on the coastline, as I'll explain shortly. The next point relates to tourism development. So There's been tourists in the Maldives since the 1970s, but in 2009, there was a very major change in government policy. And for the first time, the government allowed international tourists to stay on inhabited islands. It was a kind of a way of democratizing tourism. I think it's probably fair to call it that. But also there was a fair bit of political pressure too from Maldivian elites who wanted to build guest houses on rural islands. So again, these guest houses are very popular. They raise income, they provide jobs. People don't have to go away to distant resorts to find employment. So some islands have numerous guest houses, up to about 40, and they've grown considerably. But at the same time, as you can imagine, there's been considerable demand for infrastructure and services as well on these islands. Housing is another major change we've seen in the Maldives. Historically, homes were built from coral, which is mined from the reef. And this picture on the left is an old schoolhouse that's been built from coral. But today, with higher incomes, with fishing and tourism, many people, of course, use modern imported materials, although there is still some sand mining that occurs from the reef. So those are some of the changes, very rapid changes that we're seeing. I mean, incredible changes really just occurring in the past 10 or 20 years on rural islands in the Maldives. Now these changes are of course throwing up a lot of challenges too, one of which is coastal erosion. We're seeing accelerated coastal erosion on many islands, largely due to the construction of harbours, which changes how sand moves around the coastline. We're seeing considerable problems with waste management. Many islands do have waste management facilities on them, but many of these quickly become overloaded and unable to cope with the large quantities of waste that's produced. And also, the development of local tourism is causing, you could say, local sort of cultural challenges as well around sort of Western tourists coming into contact and mixing with local Maldivians. And of course, the Maldives is a Muslim country, and other religions in the Maldives are illegal, and alcohol is also illegal. So there's a variety of, sort of social and cultural challenges as well. So I'm aware I'm over time, so I'm just going to wrap up really. So when it comes to the urban and the rural in the Maldives, I think it's fair to say there is this dominance of what I'm calling the Maldivian grand narratives around international tourism, around geopolitics, around climate change. But within that, the key to a lot of cultural change, social change in the Maldives and island-based development is this relationship between the urban and the rural. And as I've shown, there are quite major socioeconomic and cultural changes taking place on rural islands. And I think ultimately it's these kind of development pathways that that rural islands are following is going to have a key effect on how climate change and other sorts of problems are going to be felt in the Maldives. So I'll just finish on that. And final slide, nice picture.
It's a very nice picture, Alex. Thank you. No, interesting, a great case study, and I think one that will be really useful, lots of information in it for those thinking of putting in a design for a more sensitive site. Obviously, this planet has many of them, and getting to be more so with the impacts of climate change. Thank you very much. And questions, obviously, anyone has for Alex, type those in the Q&A box for now, and then we'll come to all questions for all speakers at the end. So coming now to our third speaker, who is Antonio Jimenez Martinez, and Antonio is a geographer and managing director of the Santa Maria de Albarracin Foundation. And Antonio has dedicated his entire professional life to the structuring of an exemplary comprehensive management project for Albarracin's heritage set up through this foundation, and as well as the previous Escuela Taller programs, of which Antonio was also director. So Antonio is one of Spain's most highly regarded professionals in the enhancement of heritage through its restoration and adequate cultural promotion. So it's bienvenido to Antonio, and gracias to Julio Quijano, who is with us as well to provide translation into English. So just for anyone who would like to listen to Antonio in Spanish, make sure that on the interpretation button at the bottom of your screen, you've selected the Spanish channel. And for anyone who would like to hear translation into English from Julio, make sure that you're on the English channel. So without further ado, over to Antonio and to Julio.
Buenas tardes. Estoy encantado en poder participar en...
Well, it's a great pleasure for me to participate in this seventh session. I hope that the example of Albarracín is taken into consideration, especially in the rural areas of Western Europe. In Albarracín, in Aragon, south of Aragon, we have put in place a unique rural development program using the extraordinary heritage of the town of Albarracín as the main resource. The project is based on the unique rural heritage of historical origin. Albarracín is a medieval town which is perched atop the mountains, and it's always surrounded by the wall that defends walls and by the Guadalaviar River, which provided protection for all of the historical ensemble back in Muslim period. This town is located at an altitude of 1,000 meters south of Aragon. This town is built with very modest housing, built in plaster and wood, bunched together on the slopes of the mountains and surrounded by the Guadalaviar River that runs across the town. In the 90s, we started a major development program, which of course focused on recovering the built heritage. This started with the training and employment programs that took place in the 90s, the purpose of which was to put a stop to the migration of the local population to the urban areas, so that these 100 youngsters who participated in this program could stay through this effort at protecting and providing value to the existing heritage. This led to the creation of the foundation Santa Maria de Albarracín, which is the project that we are currently running. This is an integral heritage management project that focuses on three main areas: rehabilitation. We rehabilitated absolutely the whole built heritage of the city, especially the public heritage, its cultural revitalization to enhance economic development, and then, of course, the maintenance of all of these recovered heritage. The conference center was the first building to be that was rehabilitated. This is currently the headquarters of the foundation, followed by the Casa de Pintores, the painter's house that you can see here before and after, guest house, the townhouse. This is the Casa de la Comunidad before and after, the church, which is currently used as an auditorium. Even though we only have 1,000 inhabitants in the town, we have an auditorium in the old church, the Torre Blanca. This is the exhibition center, established in an old castle, or the Ermita San Juan, which became a function room after its rehabilitation. That is the castle, the Casa de la Julianeta, the old abattoir, which now has become the restoration center, the castle and its surroundings, the Church of Santiago, and the wall. And we are still, work is still ongoing on the wall in order to restore it back to its original condition. The cathedral is another splendid example of integral restoration, or the Ermita del Carmen, which is another excellent example of successful intervention. Of course, there's also architectural interventions, but on top of that, we have implemented a very ambitious program for the restoration of furnishings. So we do not only rehabilitate or restore the buildings, but everything inside them: paintings, historical furniture, sculptures, ceramics, etc. Everything that is part of the extraordinary heritage of the town. We have organized different training courses with the participation of the Instituto de Patrimonio de España and the Instituto Aragonés de Empleo. Many restoration experts have visited Albarracín to teach techniques. We have restored 1,528 cultural assets with the participation of 1,740 restoration experts. And on top of that, a restoration center has been established, and this has had positive impact not only in Albarracín, but in the nearby towns and the neighboring provinces. Of course, the idea is not just to restore. The second important aspect of the activity of the foundation is the cultural revitalization. We've organized courses, seminars, exhibitions, concerts, and conferences of different disciplines, and this has turned Albarracín into a reference for culture in Spain. This is the young Spanish orchestra rehearsing or giving a concert at the auditorium, the church. We've organized seminars and concerts. Apart from the restoration, we have these cultural activities, and the third leg of the foundation is the maintenance and preservation of everything we have restored. And this involves 13 different structures, and we have between 18 and 25 employees who are actively working on the maintenance and upkeep. Through the foundation, the Fundación de Santa María Albarracín, which is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year. This is the evolution of the number of visitors, more than 40,000 in a year, and the number of visitors and the number of activities and initiatives. More than 100 of those. Let's not forget we're talking about a town with only 1,000 inhabitants. As to the revitalization of the heritage, between 1980 and 2020, we have now 67 tourist facilities, hotels or guest houses, from 94 in 1980. Number of beds available 1,600. That's why this small medieval town in the south of Aragon in Spain is a model, a benchmark for the intervention on the Spanish heritage, which has turned it into a model for this type of intervention. Of course, we have sought to preserve and provide value to all of its assets. These are just a few images of the town of Albarracín, which is, I think, a beautiful example of the success of the work of the foundation through its 25 years of life.
That was wonderful. A very beautiful image to finish on as well, Antonio. Muchas gracias, and muchas gracias también to Julio for the translation. So it was another very interesting case study, I think, thinking of a really particular rural location and what's been done to preserve it, and how looking at the patterns and the models of building there might inspire new development in future by keeping that example and carrying it forward into the future. Gracias, Antonio. Our fourth speaker to come to is Philip Gorinsky, and Philip is an art historian who has worked since 2002 to restore historic timber architecture. He is founder and director of the Foundation for the Protection of Ancient Wooden Architecture in Poland, and is also the founder and director of Poland's Museum of Free Time in Kiernica Morska. Is that roughly correctly
right.
pronounced?
Yes.
Good.
Your spelling is very good.
Thanks, Philip.
Polish.
Very good.
Right.
Well, over to you now, and you're really exemplifying the rural, because we're going to have Lauren at INTBAU show your slides for you, because the internet connection, as all of us know, sometimes in rural areas, is precisely something that distinguishes it from an urban area. So we'll get those up, and over to you, Philip.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, what I would like to say, the most important in Poland, and I would say the richest treasure of Polish heritage is wooden building and traditional carpentry. And I would like to focus on this topic, on wooden architecture. And of course, all this wooden architecture in Poland is mainly built in the villages. So mostly we will be talking about rural systems. Geographic situation of Poland created actually style of architecture because Central Europe is mainly flat country, and this is why created horizontal architecture landscape. Usually with quite large settlements. What we can see on the picture is this flat landscape, flat country, where you can see a very significant rural view, where line of roofs is slightly higher than the skyline, and usually the church tower in the middle, higher than other roofs, is the peak of the roof line. And this is very typical view for not only Poland, but for whole Central Europe. Can I have slide number 2, please? This is the most significant view in Poland. It's almost symbolic It is Alley of the Willows. Usually in all the countries except Highland, I would say, except mountains, we have this Alley of the Willows. Willows were usually used for two reasons, because it's keeping the water very quickly. So usually they were planted close to the ditches. And the other reason is it was good material for heating in the stoves. Always this thin branches were cut, and after drying, it was used for heating in the houses. Can I have third slide, please? Next one. And here we can see that Polish landscape is quite diversified. However, dominating are lowlands and plains with the ditches and tree alleys. In southern part of Poland, what we see here on this picture, in lesser Poland or in Silesia, the settlement is usually in the valley, and buildings may be seen only from the short distance. However, it is always, this rural system is always, rural planning is always similar. So we have separated farms, usually separated farms. It doesn't matter if it's in the valley or it's in the lowlands, it's usually separated. And slide number 4, please. Here we can see a farm which is built with group of the buildings, which is settled by group of the buildings. On the left side, we can see the house. On the right side, connected to it, we can see the cowshed and the granary as well, and barn. And all this is built with wood. And then I will show some samples of these buildings, of these wooden buildings. Next slide, please. It is similar. It is kind of a settlement. It is in the central Poland, in Mazovia region. So usually we can see these high roofs, and as I said before, it is kind of settlements, kind of tofts with connected or separated buildings. And next slide, please. Here we can see the wooden house built in full timber, with porch. Porch is actually very important part of the Polish buildings. Not only Polish buildings, all the I would say all this humanistic architecture has got porches, and is very important. The main entrance must be pointed. It is the main thing of the building. The main part of the building, the porch. And here we have porch from the beginning of 20th century. Actually, the whole building is from the 17th century. As I said, we see the full timber house, and on the right side we see the cowshed and the barn. It is connected. It is so-called Longhouse, or from German Longhouse. It was always situated on the higher ground, in the lowlands, of course. So the higher ground was built with clay, usually built by human, of course. And then they were building the wooden construction on it. Can I have another one? Next slide, please. Here we have Silesia region, and you can see actually the buildings are it looks the same as in 18th or beginning of 19th century. We see this typical, as you can see on this building with black boards. It is typical building with post and beam system. So this is typical for Germany, for southern Poland, for western Poland. And if you look carefully, you can see some additions from 20th and 21st century, like some plastic, some metal on the roofs. But so we can see a little bit of mess in this building, some changes. But in general, the building and the shape of the building is the same, like in 18th and 19th century. And next slide, please. Here we have actually urban system. There are wooden buildings as well. It is very small town. It is very small town, but buildings, as you see, are very dense. This plan is very dense. Buildings are touching each other, is close to each other. So there's until the 18th, 19th century, there was no much difference between small towns and villages in Poland. At the end of 19th century, or even the beginning of 20th century, changed it a lot when these urban areas were growing up, and these movements of these social movements were they started. So people were migrating from the villages to the towns. But this town is saved in this 19th century view. Next slide, please. And here, similar, we have wooden building built in different construction, because few slides before we've seen full timber, but with beams cut to the rectangular, and it was constructed very carefully. Here we see more, it is log cabin, we should say, and always the tree. The tree is the symbol, because it's very, very important to say that in Poland, these wooden buildings were built with wood, not because only the wood was available so easily. So the reason was not availability of the wood, but the reason was as well the symbolic of wood and symbolic of tree and all these spiritual meanings in Polish culture. And next slide, please. And this is the same situation. Actually, this is wooden granary, Orban, and this tree growing very close to the building. It is very often where we don't know if the tree is the building or the building is for the tree, and it's connected. It's very often. Now, of course, there were different reasons why the trees were so close to the buildings, but not only practical reasons. There were very, very symbolic and very spiritual reasons as well. Next slide, please. Here we have Maynard House, Baroque Maynard House from 18th century, beginning of 18th century. And here I have to say about some historical background, because it is very important to understand, for understanding Polish architecture and Polish heritage, because Poland from the beginning of 13th century was a multicultural and multi-nation country. Many nations were settling down in Poland because it was a very large country in those times, and they were bringing in their own culture and adapting local traditions as well. So finally, the Polish architecture, mostly wooden architecture, was a mixture of styles, mixture of traditions, of constructions as well. So we have all types of wooden constructions. The social structure in Kingdom of Poland until the end of 18th century was based on democratic system of the noblemen as the landowners and the farmers, mostly peasants and cotters. Usually the manor house and the grange was an economic and cultural center of the group of the villages. Can we have the next slide? And this is another Maynard House. This rural system of the village, which was depending on road regulations on or terrain type, usually were located along the river line, some along the road, some with dense locations concentrated around the church, synagogue, mosque, or house of prayers. So Maynard House was the center, and very close to the Maynard House and very close to the Grange, which was, we can say, it was kind of the, you know, it was kind of the corporation mostly. There was a leader, the nobleman, and he was giving the style of life. He was showing not only how to behave, he was showing not only, he was giving not only the law, but also he was showing the style of architecture. So this dominating style was classicism. And actually, noblemen in Poland, they were very influenced by antique Latin culture. So they were bringing to Poland this classicism even since the Renaissance. So all the buildings, wooden minor houses, were built in classicism style from the 16th century. And of course, after that, as we can see here, we see this kind of Italian Baroque style with this very traditional porch. We can say that all the peasants or all the society was actually copying this style, and they were building their own houses with similar style and with similar decoration. Can we have another one? The next slide, please. Here we can see a typical peasant house. It is large, it is huge building, because peasants on the northern part of Poland, they were quite rich. And we can see how it is mixed. So we have this post and beam construction on the porch, because this is the porch only. This is the part of the building. The rest of the building is covered by the trees. So we can see the porch which is built in this typical for German construction, so post and beam, and we can see as well some parts of the Baroque style. So it is mixture. And next slide, please. And again, this is southern Poland and porch again. Very decorated. It looks like a candy almost, but it is the beginning of the 20th century. And here we can see as well a mixture of details, mixture of architectural details taken from the city, taken from very different places and very different styles. Next slide, please. Here we can see building in renovation. You can see this full timber construction with willow wing in the corners. This is typical construction for Polish buildings. And next slide, please. And here is building from the beginning of 20th century or end of 19th century. Behind this building, you can see the church, wooden church as well, of course, because all the buildings were wooden, most of them. Of course, here renovation is this roof is not original, as you can see, but we can point on the walls. So you see the panels, the wooden panels on the walls. And next slide, please. And this is the same building from the other side. You can see what is under these boards. So the boards are only covering the construction. The construction is log cabin, actually. It is very typical log cabins where you can see the beams cut with very simple tools, and between them you can see clay. So the distance between the beams was infilled by the clay, by the rope as well, by horsehair sometimes, sometimes by straw. So this is different type of the construction. But this boards, it is kind of insulation. Next slide, please.
Just to interrupt very briefly, Philip, to say that we'll have to wrap up for questions in a couple of minutes.
Okay, thank you. So here again, fragment of the building of log cabin. And next slide, please. And this is a sample of the barn as well, and as you see, infilled by the bricks. Next slide, please. And this is a cowshed, and built in the post and beam construction, infilled by clay. Next slide, please. This is windmill, of course. The next type of the buildings, which was very often in Poland, but now we have only almost 100 left in Poland. Next slide, please. And decorations, again, decorations of the porches. Next slide, please. Another porch, and I would like to point here on this, I would say, Palladian style. As you can see, the columns and the decorations are very similar to Palladian style. Once again, please, next slide. Here we can see this cornice, very Baroque cornice, because it is building from the 18th century, and it is peasant house building as well. And you can see the decoration is taken definitely from the Maynard houses. Next slide, please. And decoration of the next porch with windows, a lot of windows, plenty of windows. This is the beginning of 20th century as well. Next slide, please. And that's typical decoration from the end of 19th century and the beginning of 20th century. Decoration of the porch as well. Next slide, please. And again, the cornice of Baroque cornice, but it is renovated by us. Next slide, please. And of course, it doesn't matter, all noblemen or peasants, they were trying to memorize them, and just this is the name of the builder, Peter Leven. Actually, he was Dutch, and on his building in 1798. Next slide, please. And wooden barn. Here we can see some our renovation, because our foundation is renovating wooden buildings. Our idea is to renovate not only buildings. It is we try to build up or rebuild the whole structure. So we renovate the buildings. Next slide, please. Renovate the buildings, and we put people in there. I mean, we locate new farms with old buildings, and we are trying to keep them alive, to renovate this farms completely. So with animals, with people living in there, and with lands, of course, with fields and with agriculture. And next slides, please. Here is the building which was completely burned, and next slide. And this is the arcaded house. We call this arcaded house. It was peasant house, and it is the same building rebuilt. Next slide, please.
Just to say, but they must
Yes,
wrap up.
this is the last slide, and
Perfect.
yeah, okay. And this is another arcaded house. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, Philip, to make you come to an abrupt end, but it was wonderful to see all those examples of traditional houses in those rural parts of Poland, absolutely beautiful. And I think there'll be some questions that will come through now, I'm sure, from participants, so can come back to some of what you were speaking about. But just to have maybe all our speakers back on, so wanting Patrick and Alex and Antonio and you as well, Philip, to stay on. And the first question, in fact, that we've had from Toki, which is for Patrick, and just wondering about the grid patterns, Patrick, that you were mentioning in defining arterial roads for what will be new settlements, new development, how grid patterns would fit with maybe some of the older, maybe the more organic or fractal patterns and plans of places in African contexts. So I think the question is sort of what's the rationale for the grid and how does that fit with the existing?
It's a great question. I think that the idea that grid patterns are kind of an outside imposition is something that I encounter a lot, and it's actually not true. Grid patterns have emerged organically in urban settlements all around the world. The main advantage of using the grid is that it facilitates movement in a way that more fractal arrangements don't. And what that comes down to is the types of intersections that are created. So in a fractal system, most of the intersections are three-way intersections. They mainly consist of T's or similar junctions, but in a gridded system, most of the intersections are four-way intersections. So from a network perspective, four-way intersections dramatically reduces traffic congestion and provides people with much more direct routes from one place to another than a system made up of three-way intersections. So it really comes down to kind of the pragmatism and efficiency of the network that you get, which is like an order of magnitude greater. And I think the ticket there is to find, looking into the past, to find the historical references that can make that feel like a local style and that can allow that to be applied in a way that actually matches with the needs and expectations of the local population.
Very good answer. And in fact, just whilst we've got you still there, Patrick, Shapara has asked a question. Shapara, hello Shapara. In fact, we know each other. Shapara coming from Karachi, I think originally. So thinking about a country like Pakistan and thinking of cities that are rapidly urbanizing and the fact that a lot of the big cities, it's often at the expense of open space or green space. So are there strategies that planners can deploy sort of to try to obviously demarcate, as you said, so how roads and transport and infrastructure will work, but what about open spaces?
Great question. So a lot of the reason why countries that have urbanized rapidly and where cities have grown a lot don't have green and open spaces is actually because planners are trying to do too much. There's no clear hierarchy of priorities. So they're trying to enforce land use restrictions, they're trying to enforce building codes, they're trying to do renovation projects, they're trying to redevelop central areas. There's too much on their plate. What planners need to do for cities to actually have green space is they need to focus on the things that should be done before development happens. And obviously one of those is setting aside land for green and public open spaces. This is really critical. The only way that you can have green spaces in cities, just the same as with arterial roads, is if you prepare for it in advance. And that doesn't just mean drawing the plan, it means securing the land. So what planners need to do to have green and open spaces in cities is they need to prioritize that as an activity that has to occur first and actually make sure that that happens rather than getting distracted by many equally important but maybe not as time sensitive things that often take up most of their bandwidth.
Thanks, Patrick. Coming to a question for Alex. So thinking of what planning permissions are maybe necessary on the Maldives, how does the planning system generally tend to work? And also thinking of it as being a very sensitive site and sites that would have a lot of sensitivities to them. Does planning tend to be thinking ahead to how climate change might be impacting on that site, or is it often playing catch up as the changes are happening? What's the kind of harmony and balance with planning there?
Well, thank you for that that question. That's yeah, that's a difficult question to answer because there's so much going on. I mean, Male, the capital itself, is its own place in many respects, and I don't know so much about how Male works, what goes on there, because most of my work has been in the sort of outer rural islands. So I'll just talk about those. So each island, in terms of administration, each island has its own democratically elected island council, and they then report to an atoll level council. So, as you can imagine, as demand for space and the value of land goes up on rural islands, particularly with the arrival of international tourism, local councils or island councils have had to very quickly try and get on top of some quite complex planning requirements. And it's something that they've had to do. I mean, at the local island level, there often isn't that much capacity in terms of resources for planning, but most councils now do have an island plan, and they do zone different areas of the island as well for different uses. So there is a kind of an organisation and planning that goes on. However, a lot of the development that does occur on islands is not planned. It's not controlled particularly, especially as a lot of the guest houses are not locally, as in constructed by people living on the local land, but actually constructed by wealthy Maldivians living in Male, the capital, and they tend to wield quite a lot of influence and control over what goes on the local islands. So very often developments will occur, coastline developments, and local councils have limited control over that. In terms of environmental protections, there are central controls. So there's a Ministry of the Environment, and that has put in place an environmental impact assessment process for all kinds of coastal developments. And the ministry does have the powers to stop coastal developments or other kinds of developments going ahead if there's deemed to be a negative impact on the environment. And again, in practice, the system doesn't work especially well. It's seen as, it works to some extent because there have been examples where inappropriate developments have been removed or dismantled, but for the large part, the process does have a bit of a reputation as a kind of rubber stamping process. So the effectiveness of those controls, again, are limited. So there's lots of planning challenges, and very often it comes down to this need of space for housing, even on the rural islands where there's rising demand for space for people to live. So many of the local planning regulations, so for example, setbacks from the beach, for example, to prevent coastal squeeze from occurring between the population and the sea. There's meant to be something like a 20-meter setback from the beach to give that protection, but very often that isn't followed because it's not seen as realistic on many islands where there's demand for space. So there are sort of the sort of take-home message is that there are controls, but implementation is a challenge.
Planning on islands always being a very particular thing because you don't have the option of sprawling beyond a particular border because it's a pretty hard and defined edge.
Indeed. Yeah. So where you've got encroachment from the ocean as well, and that's squeezing a population that's trying to move out, it's difficult.
Thanks, Alex. I wonder if Julio might be able to help with una pregunta para Antonio, which is just wondering what might be next for Albarracín, and just in the context of thinking about designs that are taking inspiration from what's been done before and what's worked, thinking if there's potential maybe for growth within Albarracín if demand to live there were to outstrip the current size, or will the current form be kept preserved whatever demand might be?
Bueno, nos planteamos,
Well, first of all, we tackled the two main challenges. First, to maintain and revitalize everything we've restored. To finish, to maintain, and to restore everything we've done so far. That is our priority. Second, in Albarracín, there is a great threat, a great challenge, namely massive tourism. So we have tried in collaboration with the authorities, we are working on setting a certain limit to the development of tourism as the only activity. In other words, the medieval city has its own natural boundaries, but these limits are being overrun by the large number of tourists who visit Albarracín during summer or during holidays. And that is a problem indeed for a harmonious development of the town, and which has an impact on the local population. Of course, the economic revitalization results in the fact that everything is tourist oriented. And this is what we are trying to put a limit to a certain extent. So we have two clear goals. First, to continue to restore, maintain, and upkeep everything we've restored so far. And second, we try to set a limit to an excessive inflow of tourists or to the negative impact of an excessive number of tourists. And the third big challenge is that our model of restoration intervention is exported to nearby provinces, so that the model of the foundation can be then embraced as a model for the revitalization, reactivation of the rural areas of Spain. Of course, public-private partnership is absolutely essential for that purpose. So we try to put in place a rational system of management, private resources, public funding, and self-funding, which is absolutely essential for the whole of the rural areas of Spain.
¿Se ha respondido?
Sí.
I hope I have answered the question.
Sí, muchas gracias, Antonio, and thank you, Julio, as well, very much for that. Very good, very clear answer. One final question, which is for Philip and has come from Biniam. And Biniam is wondering about the role of wood as a material in current architectural practice in Poland. So what are the supply chains? What type of wood does wooden construction happen still now in terms of framing or other aspects of construction?
In Poland, is very popular now is this, I would say, Scandinavian construction, which is not the best, this typical modern wooden building, but it is going to be very trendy to build up wooden house in the village. Actually, because of this historical background, all the Polish people, they would love to have house in the village, but unfortunately, it looks like I would say American suburban. So very small places and very small settlements, and all these buildings are very tiny as well and built very close to each other. But sometimes, of course, we can see that this it is going to be better with wooden building, and and all these traditional decorations, architectural decorations, are in use again. So, but unfortunately, for me, it is not enough. It is only decoration. It is only surface. So we expect that maybe this migration from the villages to the cities will be stopped, and people again will try to live in the village. But of course, it depends on changing your lifestyle, because if you decide to live in the village and in the wooden house, you have to expect that it is not the same as living in the concrete in the town, in the city. So, but yes, it is. We have wooden buildings and we have wooden constructions, and as I said before, it is very trendy now to build new wooden buildings.
That's interesting to note, and I think something for anyone entering the architecture challenge into the design competition, wanting to think about those materials, what makes sense to use, the supply chains, the provenance, and how they're best then fit to the site, to the context. There was also a question from Fiona, which will actually help me to segue very neatly onto some notes just to close the session, which is wondering whether entries into the Architecture Challenge design competition can focus on restoring old buildings. So I think taking inspiration, Philip, from some of the images, the wonderful images that you were showing to us. And Fiona, yes, absolutely. The competition is primarily looking at designs for what would be built new, taking some of the best of what's been done before and adapting and evolving it. But if there are cases where actually to work with what is existing to turn it into better adapted and better resilient houses, then that is an entirely valid submission to the challenge, and we will take that, especially in the context of, I think everybody knows the sentence by now, which I think was a previous American Institute of Architect president who said that the greenest building is the one that already exists. So working with what's already there, good to see examples of that too. So from there, it's to say a very big thank you to our speakers, to Patrick, to Alex, to Antonio, and to Philip for joining today, and also to Lauren Holland and to Alice Preston-Jones, who've made everything possible for this session. And thanks too to our sponsors, Alireza and Mina Sagarchi, and to Stanhope Gate Architecture. You can catch up with the recording of the first 6 sessions in the series and share them, and this one will be up online as well. But also to say that later this month, on the 24th and 25th of March, INTBAU will be holding its biennial World Congress, which is going to be at the Royal Society of Arts in London, and also live streamed online. So you'll be able to join from wherever you are in the world. And the Congress is going to focus on how we build from here as the topic, and we'll have 20 speakers in 4 sessions over 2 days. And you can visit congress.intbau.org for more details on that. There'll be a session during the Congress looking at case studies that's going to be particularly relevant to the Architecture Challenge. So we're going to have examples in there of projects that are being built, that have been built, that would make really, really strong entries to the Architecture Challenge. So a good one to tune into. You can also now, to remind, if you've seen 4 of these challenge webinars, you can take a short quiz and you can then request a certificate of attendance from us, which we're also going to be accompanied by a chance to have a free virtual ticket to the Congress, being able to attend all of that for free. So I hope that a lot of you will join us later this month. And it's thanks very, very much again to our speakers for today. Thanks for joining us, all of you participants as well, and hope to see lots of you on the 24th and 25th of March. Thank you very much.